Hello, this is a video recording for the lecture 507. Our topic is experimental methods in cognitive science. It will be in two parts. In the first part, I will give a set of examples from previous research. In the second part, it will be an introduction to more theoretical perspectives to conducting experiments in cognitive science. So it will be a broader presentation of the topic. But in this part, you will see very specific examples. So to start with a clear example, if you were a student in mechanical engineering department in undergraduate, let's say, you would have learned different topics. I mean, from heat transfer to fluid mechanics to industrial manufacturing and so on. But what is interesting in this domain is that you would end up with a lot of examples, which, let's say, formulas, which are represented by mathematical equations. For example, in the heat transfer course, you would learn that the amount of heat transfer from one body to another body, I mean one object, bodily object to another bodily object, can be calculated by a multiplication of mass, changes in temperature, and so-called specific heat, which is related to the material itself. Here the point is that this looks like a miracle to me. I mean, is it possible really to multiply three variables, three values, then find the amount of heat transferred from the one object to the other? Well, this is indeed an idealization. So if you further learn about this domain, heat transfer, you would come across with applied part of it. So you would see approximations which are represented by tables or graphs. So this is interesting. On the one hand, we have mathematical equations for calculating heat transfer. On the other hand, we have these large, strange-looking tables, which are indeed approximations done by themselves too. So what is happening here? I mean, compared to elegant-looking formulas, we have these weird tables. So is it the way that we conduct scientific research? We believe that nature is, well, except for quantum level, let's say, more or less, nature is deterministic. This is an assumption behind many research domains. But the next step is that after this assumption, the next step is that we would be very happy to invent formulas, but that is not the real world. What's happening in scientific world is that you end up with approximations and correlation tables as such. Of course, this is an important point for cognitive science, because the question is, what are we going to do? I mean, is the goal of a cognitive scientist is to find, well, formulas? Maybe that's not quite plausible, isn't it? I mean, suppose that we want to end up with a set of formulas which give kind of an explanation for running mechanisms of different parts of human mind, or let's say artificial minds. So this is not very likely. Approximations, well, we don't know either. I mean, it is very difficult to make a quantification of what is happening in terms of formulas and approximations. Maybe simulations, well, we don't know actually. If you bring all this stuff together, well, you may assume that, okay, if our goal is not to invent formulas or to come up with simulations, then you may say that, okay, at least as a researcher, I should look for patterns. And if we are lucky in a specific domain of research, maybe we should look for principles, which are maybe models, if you like, which are able to predict patterns. And the next step then, when we work on this analysis to find the patterns, maybe we should specify the boundary conditions where these principles are applicable. Okay, so this is then gives us the short lesson that at least, I mean, this is the minimum that we have to work on. Whatever domain you work in cognitive science, you will be responsible in finding patterns and principles and their boundary conditions. Okay, so this is more or less what we are doing. I mean, we are not running after formulas or approximations, but this is important. So this should also be your focus. Let me at this stage provide a few examples. One of them is that this was my master's thesis, and it aimed at combining two research fields. One was language comprehension, and also I conducted a set of experiments by employing methodologies in human-computer interaction. But very briefly, let me summarize this topic so that you have an understanding of how you could approach a problem. The topic was unaccusative anergative distinction in Turkish, and this was not a well investigated domain at that time. Briefly, the idea was that there are two types of intransitive verbs. So I assume that you know what is an intransitive word. It is not a transitive word. But in intransitive verbs, there are so-called anergatives and unaccusatives. Anergatives look like John ran, and unaccusative. It is very difficult to discriminate between the two, at least in our understanding as native speakers of Turkish. But if you look at other languages, you have an idea about this. For instance, in some of Latin languages, there are some examples here. You see, there is and have, is, has, be, have. So these two are used. Auxiliary selection is different in different verbs. So I hope now you get an idea of what is happening. So in Turkish, well, it is not on the surface. I mean, it is not possible to discriminate between unaccusative and anergative by means of auxiliaries, because we don't have auxiliaries. But at that time, we believed that well, maybe there are some semantic diagnostics. Well, this is how it started. So the initial research question was, is there a phenomenon of unaccusative anergative distinction in Turkish? If exists, how can it be diagnosed? So the specification of diagnostics was our goal, and we did it by collecting data on acceptability judgments. So we presented a set of sentences, phrases to set of participants. Here is an example. If I tell you that, okay, how does it look like if I tell you, or if I use the phrase solmuş çiçekler, fine, because okay, it is acceptable. But how about yüzmüş adamlar? It is also fine. I mean, it is legitimate, but you have this feeling of unacceptability, isn't it? I mean, at least compared to the first one, the second one is a bit weird. So yüzmüş adamlar is a bit weird. So this is, we believed at that time, this is a kind of diagnostics mush participle of unaccusative or anergative distinction. So this story goes like this, okay? And of course we had an interest into its theoretical perspective. This is how it started, because we had a question in mind: what are the principles, like semantic properties, that specify this distinction? So we know that it is not observable at syntactic level, but at semantic level, could it be possible to observe it? And this is related to, if you make a further step, this is how we understand the world of language comprehension. So on the one hand, well, this should remind you David Marr's understanding of scientific research. I mean, there should be multiple levels of representation in principle, and we assume that on the one hand we have lexicon, where we believe that there are lexical conceptual structures in mind, and there is also an interface between syntactic structures and this lexicon, which you may call argument structure if you like. And this, the mush participle is allocated at this level between syntactic structure and lexical conceptual structures. So this was how the story was investigated at that time. This was an example. We started with a curiosity question but we were aware of the theoretical background, and then we ended up with a kind of clear research question and experimental work. Then this was the master's thesis, which was then published in other venues later on. Another example is this. Well, this was a PhD topic that I focused on. Here the goal is I want to present you the first-hand experience. This is why I'm presenting this stuff, right? So in this topic, the research question was that, well, we have graphs, text, and we bring things together to be able to comprehend it. Comprehend the material, maybe the text on the left, maybe the graph with textual annotations on the right. And how come? I mean, how do we understand? How do we bring together linguistic, verbal, and non-verbal entities? So this is very difficult question. So to be able to describe how difficult may it be, for instance, here you say this is a graph that shows the number of moves and animal in an island and walls in an island, and this number, at least if you focus on this graph, there are some verbal annotations here. For instance, in 1930 there was a famine, and 6 years later there was a fire, but notice this straight line here. So it is not part of the graph. So you may assume that, okay, we learn all about this, but this is not the good answer to that. So here, if you go back to this, how you bring all these usual terms to this graph, so this is a challenge. You will see how interesting this topic may be in a few minutes. What happened was this. We knew that, okay, language is an arbitrary relation, or it consists of arbitrary relations between words and concepts. I mean, what I mean by arbitrary is this. If I have the term pencil, then P-E-N-C-I-L, this is just a random connotation of the pencil object. Okay, so because it could have been another word that represented the pencil object as we observe in different languages, but so this was kind of in that, from this perspective, it's kind of conventional system. So these relations are abstract relations. So if you don't know the meaning of the pencil, then you don't know that this word addresses an object in the world. So this is why we mean by being conventional system. Okay, so this is language. Okay, but what about pictures? Pictures are different. I mean, I'm not talking about photo of something. I mean, this is not that's straightforward. But at least in most of the figures, there is similarity between spatial layouts. I mean, if you this is a clock, this is a watch. Sorry, this I guess this is a watch. But if you look at these two figures, the second one is a representative of the first one. Yes, maybe it is simplified form. Well, maybe, but still it has similar spatial layouts, and it is important. That is the important thing. So here there is no abstraction. A few abstractions maybe by means of these verbal entities, but more or less, well, there is no abstraction, similar spatial layout, etc. So it is important to think about in this detail. I mean, if you want to approach any topic in terms of scientific systematic research investigation perspective, you have to have a very close look to what's happening when we think about these objects. Okay, so to sum up, then we said that, okay, in pictorial illustrations, the basis is the similarity between spatial layouts between the representing entity and the represented entity. I mean, here this is the representing entity for that, and this is the represented entity, which is represented by this figure. Okay, well, but statistical graphs are different. So if you think about what is represented in a statistical graph and what are the representing entities, the life is more difficult. I mean, there is some abstraction here. For example, Consider this one. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, and there is temperature December 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and temperature in degrees 5, 10, 15, 20. And here what we understand, if I ask you to read this graph, you would say that okay, the temperature was about, let's say, 11 degrees on December 6, then it decreased to 9 maybe. Next day it increased to 8, and so on and so forth. And this is the story for Ankara too. But what is interesting here is that you may be curious. I mean, you may think like a child, and you may ask, well, okay, what is this bar? What is the straight line here? I have 5 temperature values in this graph, because this is how I possibly sketch this graph. But what is happening here? I mean, is it the case that at midnight of, let's say, December 6, I started to measure the temperature, until the midnight of December 7 it decreased? No, of course it is not the case, because if it were the case, then I mean, if it were a vertical representation of moment by moment changes in temperature, then I would end up with another graph, isn't it? So there will be some fluctuations because of the day, time, and so on. But well, then this is an abstraction. So this is a convention, because I am not questioning what is happening between December 6 and 7. I mean, this is, well, this may look very stupid to you, but this is important to understand, that this spatial similarity stuff doesn't work in graphs, isn't it? So if I say that the temperature started to increase, well, it would be a misnomer. I mean, I wouldn't say that it started to increase at the midnight of December 7. But here the thing again is that these are all conventions. You may think that, okay, well, what is weird, what is interesting about this? But you will see how interesting this topic may be, because, well, if you suppose that you are a blind person, and you want to understand this graph, and suppose that you have a table. Now, as a person who is able to see, we are able to say that the temperature decreased, increased, decreased, increased. Maybe there is a zigzag changes in temperature, but it is very difficult to generate these sentences for blind person. So this is the challenge between vision and language. How do we describe what we see? So definitely we are not computers in that sense. I mean, if I were a computer, I would say that December 6, 7, December 7, 8, December 8, 5. So it is not the story. We make a narrative of these graphs. Coming back to this, our point, we said that, okay, the relationship between represented and representing entities are not subject to iconic similarity in case of statistical graphs, because they are developed by us, not like figures, not like pictures. We invented them. If you go to the 18th century, there's a history about it. There's an explicit invention of statistical graphs, and then they became tools for communication and reasoning, like language, isn't it? We also invented language, and we invented it in an abstract context too. Okay, so you may also notice that these data graphs or statistical graphs are very different than mathematical functions. So if I'm, well, they may be looking the same, but they're very different. This is a function graph. This is a statistical graph. The one on the left is a visual representation of this table. The one on the right is a visualization of a function. Totally two different things. Although they are similar, they are very different in terms of how we comprehend them, isn't it? Okay, more on top of that, suppose that I only focus on statistical graphs, and I want to represent this table by means of different graphs. What I end up with this. Suppose it's possible, of course, to use alternative visualizations to represent the same data visually. What is happening here is that if I use this type of line graph, well, there is a story here. I mean, decrease, increase, but if I use this, I immediately start with comparatives, isn't it? I would say that, at least, I mean, in my case, when I read it, I would say that, well, on December 6, it is whether in Istanbul was higher than Ankara, so on and so forth. So I try to do here pairwise comparisons when the same data is represented with bar graph. And when it comes here, this even becomes weird. I mean, it is difficult to interpret that. It is difficult to make binary comparisons, pairwise comparisons. Well, of course, people knew about that. I mean, if you look at the book How to Lie with Statistics, How to Lie with Graphs, as I remember, this was the title. This type of visualizations have always been used for manipulating people's perception, which eventually manipulates their thoughts. So here the thing is that, again, from our perspective as a cognitive scientist, my perspective was that how do so what are the invariants underlying this graph? So this was the question. Okay, this required a careful look at the language of graphs. So, for example, here is I picked one specific type of statistical graph, which was line graphs in time domain. Then I noticed that these graphs actually represent state processes and trends. For example, if you read this text here, there are certain terms like this population. This is a population graph in a lagoon. It's a lake, and this graph was about the number of bird species in the lagoon, their changes in years. There are certain terms like increase, decrease, remain stable. Okay, this opened the door to me, because I realized that if I focus on these verbs more closely, I would end up with kind of an ontology of this terminology. So this is how you may proceed if you decide to focus on specific type of words. For example, if you look at the literature on language comprehension, you see different type of verbs, like verbs of change, stative verbs, etc. And there are further and further subtypes: change of location, change of orientation, in other case in stative verb, change of state verbs, etc. Okay. If you focus more and more on this domain-independent terminology, which includes general terms like peak, increase, decrease, etc., you find motion verbs, prepositional phrases if you focus on English, and there are directional and non-directional prepositional phrases, temporal modifiers, scalar adjectives, adverbs. So this is interesting. There are certain invariants in this language, but if you focus on a domain-specific terminology, it is more difficult to investigate. But if you focus on domain-dependent terminology, you also find other terms like rally climbing and stock market graphs. So okay, then up to this point I said that there is some regularities, there are patterns in terminology of communication through graphs. Remember the initial slides, I said that we should look for patterns and study the conditions, boundary conditions of these patterns. Then I had a closer look at the examples. I mean, for instance, I picked certain parts of those documents that I found. These are not designed by me. I mean, these are available documents, and I investigated these sentences more closely. For example, here, this increase is represented by increase steadily, which was a scalar gradable adverb. And in another example, so this was this sentence was full of prepositional phrases like from a peak of, or less from one point to another point, etc. And there were also temporal modifiers. So I was able to find a terminology of all this stuff, invariants, by analyzing the sentences. And so now comes the argument structure. Remember that argument structure in the previous example was the interface between the lexicon and the syntax. And I assumed that, okay, if I see the word decrease in a sentence, I should think of two parameters. One may be related to temperature. I apologize. One may be related to time, temporary dimension. The other may be related to value dimension. Okay. Then if I think about the mapping, or let's say I think about graphs as mappings from temporal domain to the value domain. Actually, I'm talking about the path in the value space. It may be a bit difficult to understand for you, but what I mean here is this. This is a mapping between time and a value in the domain, isn't it? So this is a path. It is not by chance that the description of abstract path in language corresponds to description of this line in the graph domain. So this was the major finding of this PhD thesis. And then I thought that, okay, maybe I can come up with an abstract representation of this natural language sentences by means of their source, goal values, and temporary time values. And when it came to the world of graphs, I also noticed that there are certain graph segments. Since I was focusing on visual cognition at that time, I thought that, okay, maybe I could come up with a set of representations which may correspond to linguistic representations, or let's say abstract representations of linguistic entities. Okay. Also interestingly, this topic was of interest to Steven Pinker in 1990s, and so he was focusing on other aspects of the diamond spatial reference system. So this is quite an interesting domain. Remember that we started by asking very straightforward questions about, well, what is a statistical graph, how I represent temperature, etc. But then we proceeded with this type of detail in this study. Then, okay, if I attempt to design, let's say, a life cycle of how to understand this type of text systematically, I would say that, okay, I extract linguistic verbal entities, then I extract lines and perform segmentation and of lines. Look, this is another topic. I mean, how do we segment lines? Very difficult topic of research, but it depends on the number of clusters. But then do they have names? So another thing here, maybe this corresponds to an increase, maybe this corresponds to a stable period of time. But then if you segment it further and further, you may end up with different terminology, linguistic terminology, which is called problem of granularity. But again, so in principle it's possible. So it would lead to a computational model. At that stage we stopped in this thesis work, but it is possible to continue with computational model. Remember, this may have practical implications, but that is not that crucial for this type of research. I mean, you may create a language generation system. I will go back to the previous slide, which is going to employ this terminology to be able to create natural language sentences. But here the finding was the path concept. I mean, this thesis was able to show that the concept of path in language was represented visually in line graphs, and then unsurprisingly we find correspondences between visual entities and linguistic entities. Okay, so this was the second example that I wanted to show. So in these two examples, what you learned was actually they were kind of a continuum, but where basically we aim at finding patterns and regularities, and if you want to develop a computational model after, then you may proceed with designing some simulations that are able to, let's say, maybe recognize sentences in graphs, or maybe generate sentences for a given graph. So this is, when I do this, I'm not talking about human minds only, because it's possible to design artificial minds which are able to perform all these actions. Okay, not as humans. I mean, it is not, I don't mean that they should be like humans. It is not the case, but it is another story that if you assume that you expect a similarity at a behavioral level, then okay, well, I will, you may say, I will design an artificial agent which is able to talk like humans, but it doesn't mean that they're going to think like humans. So it's another story. But for that purpose, we conducted experiments. Okay, so eye tracking experiments existed in that research, comprehension experiments, even learning and memory experiments. But of course, in the background, we always had a theory. We had a theory how to represent conceptual structures in well, language and vision and so on. Okay. For this, your responsibility as candidate cognitive science researchers is to learn statistical analysis, machine learning modeling, because these are the tools that we employ for finding patterns. And when you do this, be careful about your assumptions. For example, if you say that you are going to develop a robot multisensory memory, well, it is a big question. Okay, so you should learn then how to narrow down your questions of research and try to find reasonable outcomes. And for this, again, a few remarks to finish this lecture. You Well, using a search engine is fine, but you should do more than that. I mean, you should learn how to find academic research, academic resources, and you should spend effort to attend to international conference. And don't forget that, don't be discouraged by titles of articles. I mean, usually titles are too much. So you should read the content and see what this article is giving as the message. And if possible, you should talk to your supervisor. You will get an impression of whether your studies are publishable or not. And if possible, you should publish them in conference, so maybe in posters, also to get to know other people in your community. So it is also nice. I mean, if you are able to make a publication, it is an indicator that your research is recognized by the community. Okay, so this is the end of the first part. In the next part, I will proceed and another broader uh, presenting a broader view of experimental methods in cognitive science. All right, thank you very much. Have a nice day.